should be fairly loose. So, and like there's this grand divide at the moment in the room, but if you want to jump off from this side and go over and grab a drink, or if you want to shout out a question or whatever, then please do so. Don't be shy. So I'll get into popular hiking trails in a second, but that's loosely going to be the theme of the talk. But please get involved. You have to bear with the sound.
For everyone today to be everywhere of tomorrow. Let us explore together the future. A future not of dreams, but of reality. It is now tomorrow. On the moon, there is no air to breathe, no rain to fall, no sound that can be heard. Yet here is man, exploring, building his first bridgehead in his span of space. In local laboratories, form expeditions into the vast white wastelands that were still unknown. And here is Weather Central, forecasting to the world the great climatic changes born in the Antarctic's never-ending winds. In aquacopters, search the ocean floor to find miles deep, vast fields of precious minerals and ores. And in the deepest trenches of the seas, study at first hand long-hidden secrets of survival. Fabulous coral reefs lead us back to the land, an equatorial land. Now, technology has found a way to control the wild profusion of this wonder world. A jungle road is built in one continuous operation.
I mean, for those of you that can't hear, so apologies, but this is the 64-65 Futurama ride through the World's Fair. And really what it was an automated conveyor belt that would take people through the wonders of the future. And it was all kind of marvels of speculative landscapes where there was this optimism about the relationship between technology and nature. And I always like to start with this clip because it looks on yesterday's tomorrows, in an endearing way. Because really that's kind of what we do in Tomorrow's Sort Days. So the Tomorrow's Sort Days is the Futures think tank, the urban think tank that I run in London with a few other people. And what we try and do with Tomorrow's Sort Day, I suppose, is that we believe that kind of as architects we're in this really exciting and unique position where we span the gulf between the cultural and the technological. And it means that we can really synthesize a whole series of complex factors. And we can take that role, I suppose, and as architects we can ask questions as opposed to a traditional role of kind of finding solutions. But really what we're trying to do is identify new areas for operation the architect might kind of start to find themselves within. We like to think of ourselves in a way as sort of as cultural agitators, I guess. So we design and illustrate future scenarios rather than discrete buildings. And really, it's about borrowing from these tools of speculation, whether it's the Futurama ride and the imaginings of what could come, or whether it's science fiction or film or pop culture, as a means to actually start to speculate on the implications of emerging technologies and biologies and the possibilities therein. But one thing, as Geoff said, that I also do is run the Unknown Fields Division, which is a teaching studio. It's the son of the teaching wing of Tomorrow's Sort Today. I run that with Kate Davies at the AA. And we like to call ourselves a kind of nomadic design studio, I suppose. If TPT is kind of based in London and because with speculation, unknown fields gets us out in the landscape. So we go on 2 expeditions a year to the ends of the earth to explore kind of forgotten landscapes, alien terrains, obsolete ecologies. And we sort of occupy these shifting fields between nature and artifacts and examine our contemporary relationships to the natural world. And that's really the kind of the core interest, I suppose. So we go out to these kind of sites as a means to experience the present as a site of strange and extraordinary futures. And because we travel to these places that I'll go through later on, because we see them as very much microcosms of a lot of the issues that we deal with in much more abstract terms in a much more familiar and everyday metropolises. So we travel out to these extreme locations because they're, I guess, there's an immediacy where you see issues around these things of nature and technology playing out. And it's also great to get students out of the hermetically sealed context of the design studio and get them out in the world and kind of confront them with issues which is so easy to kind of deal with naively back in the safety of the studio. So really what I wanted to do tonight, I guess, was to take us on a tour, I suppose, of some of these landscapes. Popular hiking trail, field guide through the technology of landscape. And in the vein of the night school, I thought we could do it as kind of like a sort of like a dreaded holiday slideshow. You know, where you go into someone's place after they've been back from some terrible tourist location. Friends get around over kind of nachos and terrible guacamole, and just kind of drink themselves stupid, trying to ignore the boring shit that's going on the screen. So I'm going to do a slideshow of just, I guess, all of these strange locations that we've been through. And please, if you have a question about one or you want to dwell on one, then jump out and let me know. But also, like kind of avid twitchers or bird watchers will also encounter sort of strange creatures along the way, I suppose. So it's a scenic hike through the science fictional present, I guess, where some of these landscapes will be fictional, some will be real, some will be historic. And what we'll see, hopefully, is the idea as we kind of trek off through this landscape with the division. We'll see nature as a sort of a cultural construction, I guess. And the way of kind of interweaving into it fictional things is also to start to think about the way that actually the imagination is far more active in our perception of landscape and nature than what we think. That nature isn't a finite thing, it isn't this primordial, kind of untouched, rare thing that we need to be trying to maintain or conserve, but it's actually a moving target. A target that certainly now must be kind of re-evaluated in the context of bioengineering, prime time cosmetic surgery, engineered meat, and all this sort of stuff. So pack a lunch and let's head off. Because really this is, I guess, the core thing of what we try and do, I suppose. I had a quote from Chris, the real voyage of discovery is not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. You know, that idea that we don't just go out to see and fetishize these things, but we go out as a means to come back and understand the present in a new way. So in the grand tradition of the explorers like Darwin and his trip on the Beagle, or Ruskin and his sketchbooks here from going through Venice, or John Soane, the collector, we explore this idea of looking as a project in itself, you know, where the act of looking is a strategy to defamiliarize oneself, and what we say is to explore alternative worlds as a means to understand our own world in new ways. So that may be to go off to an extraordinary and extreme landscape as a means to understand our own city in a new way, or to construct a fantastical kind of science fictional project as a means to understand the present in a new way. So in order time to guides and descriptions of nature, I guess, began in allegory. They began in fiction as well. I'm thinking of like Pliny the Elder is the copy of his book as our first kind of stop through on our hiking trail. There, kind of people were starting to travel, and they brought back stories of myths and strange monsters and exotic animals. And it was really kind of an allegorical tradition of nature, I guess, that described nature through myth and story. And across time, that kind of slowly gave way to, you know, these are kind of some Darwin sketches of the different finches in the Galapagos. It gave way to kind of a more objective form of zoology and botany, but it also gave way to the pioneer and the colonial traveller. There's some slides from our trip 3 years ago to Amazonia, Ecuadorian Amazon and Galapagos Islands. Because here, you know, our botanists kind of travelled off, like Lord Darwin's expedition, and they described what, for the most part, was an untouched or pristine wilderness. Now, the Amazon is now, of course, the conservation of the icon of the conservation movement as our first, that's the big gesture to kind of start the tour with. We travelled here 3 years ago for the 150th anniversary of Darwin's Origin of the Species. And we're interested in seeing this primordial wilderness, seeing this icon, and just how it started to take shape in our collective consciousness. But of course, we think of it as a jungle. But recently, people, through satellite imaging and through passing across newly cleared land, they've found all these extraordinary excavations. And the discussion around the Amazon now is that it's not really a jungle at all, that it's actually a cultivated garden. That what we think of as being pristine and untouched wilderness is actually the result of hundreds and thousands of years of cultivation of edible plants and edible fruits. And that across time, actually, the Amazon is really a whole network of rainbow garden cities, stretching out over an area that's greater than the sprawl of Los Angeles. And this is the place that we hold up as being this pristine, untouched thing to preserve. Because really, I think what the discussion around this wilderness is it gets us into the idea on our tour that wilderness is actually a highly politicized term. It's a highly problematic term. That these objective zoologists that came here to record weren't interested in the native people that are occupying this land. They weren't interested in the indigenous kind of cultures of cultivation. They were only interested in cataloguing the exotica of animals they take back to London with them. So they saw it as being untouched, to the idea of terra nullius, as in kind of a land without ownership. And this is really kind of where our contemporary view of nature starts to come from, the idea that nature, the natural world and our own world are in some way in opposition to one another, that wilderness can't exist with people in it, which is an intensely problematic scenario. So in the Ecuadorian Amazon, we stayed with local tribes, worked with them in the jungle, and we visited these kind of sites as well. This is in the middle of the jungle. It's a place called Lago Agrio, which means sour lake, which is the Texaco Oil Company's hometown. And it's another strange form of wilderness where prostitutes roam the streets, kind of servicing the migrant workers, and the thick smell of exploitation kind of hangs heavy in the air. And all through, stretching out from this town, are these oil pipelines which run all the way from the Amazon out to the Colombian coast. So kind of hidden within this wilderness is not only kind of politicized idea of it being untouched, but it's also another kind of strange new nature of kind of various anacondas filled with blood of oil stretching out across the coast. So what we were, of course, watching was a continuation of a process that stretches back hundreds of years. The technologies of cultivation, be it oil or cultivation of edible fruits, has actually existed in this place for a long, long time. So this is a taxidermy piece from Charles Watterson. He travelled through South America, through the Amazon in the early 1800s. He was a close friend of Joseph Banks. He did a lot of real science out there, did a lot of documentation. But one thing he did do also when he came back was carry out a whole series of extraordinary scientific hoaxes. So this is one of his hoaxes that he tried to kind of play off as a real specimen. I think the story about it is that he brought all of his, much like me going into the Geoff's Landscape Future exhibition, he got caught in customs with all these crazy animals, and the customs guy stopped him and took all the specimens back, so he wasted a whole big period of his travels. So he went back again and came back. He brought this with him, and apparently it's a face that's been fashioned from the arse of a monkey. And the facial expression and the features are supposedly mimicking the customs officer that barred him the first time. But what starts to happen is that through these extraordinary hoaxes, and he's not the only one, you start to see another sort of image of nature emerging through the Victorian era, and that is the kind of the nature of freak shows, P.T. Barnum Circus, the Womble's Menagerie, which is pictured here. Nature is presented as a strange curiosity, so travel opens up this idea of the exotic animals, the exotic nature. And then, kind of as myth and allegory, like we saw with Pliny, starts to disappear, what starts to come up is the idea of the exotic animal starts to take place. Victorian techniques and kind of taxidermy starts to come into being. This is Walter Potter, another kind of famous Victorian taxidermist who would travel around with what he called the his collection of curious taxidermy, which are all kind of fake specimens of kittens with another kitten stuck on the back. And he's also famous, you probably would have seen these, of all these strange, very twee scenes of animals playing instruments. But then looked at the rise of natural history museums and taxidermy and all those sorts of things. But you know, in a way, what we've been doing is dealing either with myth and allegory or with exotica, to use these sort of fictions in a way to come to terms with natural phenomena that we don't understand. You know, and on our kind of tour through these hinterlands, I think that's something that'd be nice to sort of stick with us, is this idea that, you know, we use fiction and we construct these cultural imaginings of nature as a means to start to understand it in our own terms. So part of that is these extraordinary bestiaries. Bestiaries are the collection from medieval times, but there's now contemporary bestiaries of mythical beasts and strange creatures. They're things like the griffin, the dragon, all those sorts of things. What's nice about them, and that kind of idea that we've been talking about, that the idea of kind of dealing with phenomena we don't understand, is that these are at one time kind of creatures of wonder and mystery and intrigue, but at the same time they form catalogues of the fears of the time. You know, the dragon is actually saying something about the fears of the people living at that particular moment. So they're both fictional, but they're also catalogues of very real things. And I think those relationships are kind of interesting. Especially when you think of a contemporary bestiary. This is the Book of Imaginary Beings by Jorge Luis Borges, one of the magical realists. So in his bestiary, he collected together the whole history of magical animals. And the phrase that he used was necessary monsters to describe them. And that phrase, I think, is something really nice to kind of take away with us as well. The necessary monster for him was a kind of a cathartic beast, that we invented these things as some sort of essential process that helped us to cope with an unknown world. You know, and that sort of stretches back from the idea that, you know, when the sun rose up and down and kind of gave us corn, we didn't know why we did it, so we invented the sun god and started to deal with nature in that kind of way. And that kind of then continues with another kind of bestiary, in this case a bestiary of botany. This is by a book by Lionel Leone. Fantastic book if you can find it, it's pretty rare. But it's called Parallel Botany. I'll read the quote here. The study of parallel plants has often been underappreciated and ignored by other biologists. There are, of course, many reasons for this, but chiefly the principal difficulty with studying parallel plants is their lack of the basic property possessed by the vast majority of other non-parallel plants, namely the property of existence. For example, the non-existence of parallel plants and their consequent matterlessness and invisibility have proved to be formidable obstacles to collecting adequate specimens. So you see these extraordinary plants that he's invented. This is the Gurulana, which is a plant that you can only see in the moonlight. This is the Trillis sylvidor, whose habit is to emit shrill screams on cold nights in January. So really what that... Yeah, go on.
I'm a bit confused about the logic that you're laying out, whereby making nature mythologized is this thing that's yet more fantastical and perhaps more mysterious, more fearsome, is a way that we are coping with the fear of the unknown, as opposed to like maybe the trend that you see now in a lot of like monster movies where we try to humanize, like say Godzilla, it's just trying to protect its mother, which to me would seem like a stronger indication of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of these creatures is that we are trying to anthropomorphize them, you know what I mean? That a natural cycle, for instance, that we don't really know anything about, we start to donate it to a creature, we can start to understand its behavior, you know what I mean? That they may be kind of fantastical and magical, but they're still relatable. You know, that culturally we can start to relate to those fictions, I guess. Much more, sorry?
Maybe we've invented them ourselves.
Yeah, but we invent them in our own image in a way, I suppose. You know, like that it's much easier to understand a natural system based on, or rather than dealing with it as an abstraction, but dealing with it by personifying it within a creature.
Wait, but I thought you just tried to say that what we're not doing now is anthropomorphizing that,
No, I think we are. I mean, like, because one thing I'll show later on is the Godzilla myth, for instance, which is dealing with an emerging technology of nuclear energy, for instance. And it was kind of a culture's way of coming to terms with and understanding their fears about the dawn of nuclear age. You know, that happened when the nuclear tests in the Bikini Atoll affected and kind of killed the fishermen on one of the fishing boats. You know, and that became the birth of the Japanese monster genre. You know, so that it was a fiction, but to put the fear of the abstract menace of the nuclear age within an image like Godzilla, a story like Godzilla, you can then start to relate to it in a different way. You know what I mean?
Not really.
I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that our relationship to nature is changing across time, I suppose. It's a cultural construction, as opposed to it being a finite thing. So it's interesting then to look at kind of this book, Ecotopia. You know, Ecotopia is this kind of dream research to associate with, an idea about living in harmony with the natural world. It was a book written by Ernest Camelback in 1975. And what makes Ecotopia special, I suppose, is that really in the 70s actually provides a roadmap for sustainable living from 75 and beyond. It envisions a near future where there's a political movement that has succeeded in creating a harmony between man and nature, I suppose. The society described in the book is one of the first ecological utopias that we encounter, I suppose, and really one of the births of the counterculture movement, the Green Movement. And the book is set in 1999 and consists of entries of protagonist William Weston, who's a mainstream media reporter who is based in America proper, but then kind of goes off to investigate this breakaway state of ecotopia. He falls in love with a local wild lady and ends up converting, I suppose. But the book was kind of researched by Camelback, and it's actually backed up by real science. A lot of the technology and stuff that starts to appear in the book is directly coming out of some of the pages of the journals at the time. And what you see is this optimistic relationship between the supporting relationship of technology to that of nature, which is very different, I suppose, in a way to what is really the contemporary retelling of Ecotopia, which is Avatar. You know, the plot sounds familiar, right? Guy goes off into a strange land, falls in love with local girl, starts off being kind of terrible and bastardly, but then kind of learns the ways of a new place. And the difference, though, between Avatar, a contemporary version, and the Ecotopian myth, the early Ecotopian myth, is that their nature is always rendered as this primitive state, destined to be corrupted by industry. As the Gardens of Pandora are mined, for what's probably the worst kind of title in the history of film adaptation. Which is then interesting then to compare it to something like Miyazaki's Nausicaa, as another stop on our tour. Similar kind of themes, but here, like Ecotopia, there is this relationship between technology and nature, I suppose, where actually this, what appears to be a toxic forest, is actually an engineered kind of edifice that's cleaning the landscape in a way. So it's kind of a biotech odyssey into GM crops that turn out to save the world in the end, as opposed to destroy it. So I think, in those kind of three samples, there is these different kind of relationships in nature, evidenced through popular culture, but that also start to be evidenced in our political relationships to those landscapes, the conservation movement, the actual things that we're doing in terms of our relationship to resources and in terms of our relationship to the conservationists. Miyazaki, of course, has funded his own bestiary of mythic animals to describe all these different possible relationships in nature. And like I was starting to talk about with Godzilla, the traditional monster stories and ghost stories of Japan also do this. This is there's a whole collection of these creatures in Japanese culture called the yokai. Some are evil and some are playful, but they're all kind of ghosts and creatures of nature. And they're becoming part of lived culture in strange and unexpected ways. which of course culminates, as I was saying, in the most iconic, cathartic of necessary monsters, that of Godzilla. As I was saying, it's referring to kind of the tragedy of the Japanese fishing boat caught in the Bikini Atoll tests. But it's an early example of new nature, where natures of technology, contamination, radiation, start to become introduced in the same way that we're at a point where new sorts of things are starting to be introduced now that we're not quite sure how to deal with. This is kind of Japanese culture's way of starting to cope with that. And that strategy has started to continue through a whole new breed of robot taxidermy. I see these in the tradition of Victorian taxidermy that we kind of started with. Because in a strange way, the evolution of technology in Japan is like, I guess, the evolution of animals in the Galapagos. I don't know if you've ever kind of been, but the technology there is so culturally specific, whether it's the nutty toilets, or it's the phones that actually still can't work outside of any other country, that there is this kind of isolation within Japan that breeds real technological idiosyncrasies, I suppose, that in a way I think also start to relate to the yokai and the cultural relationships in ancient technology. But it also sets the ground for an idea of what will happen to a mutated technology, just like mutations in the Galapagos. Which is, again, my segue into starting to think about the last part of this night, which will hopefully be talking about new possibilities and new sorts of specimens and things. One that I'm currently working on at the moment is the foothills of Mount Fuji, what's called the suicide forests, where lots of people kind of disappear in the forest to start to die and kill themselves. And I'm kind of starting to work on a new species, a new creature roaming the forest, a designed suicide monster or a euthanasia machine, I suppose, that actually lives in the forest as a strange sort of retired ghost. I started to do a version of this. This is the kind of precursor to Geoff's exhibition of landscape features. This is in a gallery in Mood. It's rather than Specimens of Unnatural History. This is landscapes of unnatural history. So the little twinkling lights there, the forest of LEDs, is actually a virtual forest of the suicide forest in Japan. So there's a few kind of wind sensors at the base of Mount Fuji within that forest that are then linked up to these LEDs. So every time the wind wafts through the forest in Japan, this strange sort of artificial forest starts to twinkle in the same sort of way. So it's the first kind of attempt at starting to build a connection between these two worlds. But now, while we're talking about kind of Galapagos and new specimens, we bought a boat and sailed off to go connect with the Galapagos. We went here again 3 years ago after we went to the Amazon. And our experiences there form the basis for the stuff that Geoff was showing in the Landscape Futures exhibition. And the Galapagos, for those that don't know, is really the birthplace for the ideas of the origin of the species. Darwin went there and found the speciation on all the different islands. What's happening now, though, is a growing struggle between the tourist industry and the fragile endemic ecology. Despite measurements the government's putting in place, there is still this extraordinary struggle playing out. So this is the street that you don't see. It's on the other side of the lens, on the other side of the camera to the nature documentary. This is downtown Galapagos, Santa Cruz. And despite extraordinary quarantine measures, there's still kind of huge problems with invasive species. And what's happening now is that this primordial idea, again, like the Amazon, the iconic wilderness of Galapagos, where you go into extraordinary measures in order to maintain that idea. And I guess the discussion as we go across this tour is that kind of fixing nature at a certain point seems sort of strange in the context of Galapagos being something, the idea of nature itself being something that's ever moving.
Decided this severe problem needed radical solutions.
So this is how they're dealing with goats in the Galapagos, the invasive species. This is conservationists that are here hanging out of the window of helicopters as they fly over the landscape, leaning out, Apocalypse Now style, with M16 machine guns, taking them out. And this is an extraordinary kind of conservation.
Patrolled 400,000 hectares of goat-infested island, a landscape denuded by the insatiable pests.
And then what you have also, because of these extreme measures that ecologists are going to, you then have this conflict with the tourist industry and with the fishing industry, This is an extraordinary kind of news article. Note the headline, Galapagos tortoises held hostage. It's from a protest where the fishermen went into the islands and took some of the tortoises hostages to say that these things, we're saying that they're meaning more than human life. But if you look at the byline, more than 30 scientists and several giant tortoises are being held hostage. We don't really care about the 30 scientists, it's the tortoises. They're the precious things. And really that's kind of talking to the idea of what we're seeking to maintain. It also goes back to that very idea we see in the Amazon, of the idea of nature being untouched and pristine. And here is another version of the goat killers. This is what they're trying to do to get rid of rats, which are another invasive species. These helicopters fly into these areas where they pick up these massive loads of rat poison, which is the little blue square that you see on the right there, and they dump it across the landscape to kill the rats. They've also introduced ladybugs from my home country of Australia to eat these introduced insects, which are now eating all the plants. So rather than being a pristine wilderness, just like the Amazon in a way, what we're seeing is that Galapagos is much more like a managed garden, a kind of a curated zoo of the idea of what nature used to be. We fixed nature at a certain point back when Darwin went through, and that's what we've got to try and fight to maintain. Ironically, in the very spot where the idea of nature as being a constantly evolving, never-changing thing was born. So I guess the impetus for the project then that Geoff was talking about was the idea of what sort of other species might we imagine occupying this landscape beyond the helicopters and the poison. How far would we go to protect this thing? What is the role of conservation? What is the role of technology within conservation? And can we imagine a new design set of species, a new design set of invasive species with a remedial effects for this new kind of wilderness? So these in the exhibition space suggest that are kind of these miniature little pockets and islands recreated for the Landscape Futures show. This is just a zoom. I don't have footage yet, unfortunately, of the Manaugh show, but this is from the precursor show that I took about the moon. So they've become these living mountains of moss and kind of a taxidermy robotic zoo of these new specimens. Catalogued as a collection of still lifes, stuffed and mounted taxidermy robots, curios, trophies, exotica, speaking back to the techniques of taxidermy from Victorian times, where nature was a curiosity, the idea that nature, again, in light of these new technologies, in light of these things that we're talking about, we're at a point where it's strained again. And these become kind of one way of starting to engage with that, resulting from the interbreeding of nature and technology. These things have arrived unannounced, kind of from random, uncontrolled organization to occupy the landscapes as a kind of a new form of infrastructure, I suppose, within their life. And this is the floor of the Reno hotel room, guys. The photo was setting up. So there's a few species that we'll just run through quickly. So this is what's called the seed clouds. One of the big problems with invasive species coming into the Galapagos is birds are bringing them in through their droppings. So these, just like the birds, drift through the sky and kind of seed bomb the landscape, quite with endemic species. They're made from layers and layers of lightweight sails, and they drift on the wind back and forth. And as the birds unknowingly bring alien seeds, these bots deliberately carry with them native seeds released in the Guava season, which is the wet season. Their sails, the deformation and fold of their sails act as fold catchers, collecting moisture, germinating their cargo before releasing them. Just like when the coral spawns, these robots are triggered when the humidity is just right. So when you see these kind of spores drifting in the wind, they signal the onset of Galapagos' critical El Niño season. So that kind of registers with the landscape as well. Or the poison mist machine, which is the evolution of the helicopters dumping the poison. Like crop duster planes, these flocks of quadcopters drift across the landscape, releasing poison to kill off the rodents. And they're in dialogue with what's called the Judas rodents, which is based on the idea of the Judas goats. Like when those goat killers were in those helicopters, sharp shooting out the window, they actually had planted Judas goats, which were like conspiracy goats. So they were goats with conspirators, I should say, with tracking devices on them. And they would run with the herd and they would tell the guys in the helicopters where the goat herds are. The idea is that these kind of rodents act in collaboration with the poison mist clouds to draw them near and tell them where the rats are. They broadcast with their GPS tracking. Or the flower shredder, which is the native Galapagos bee can only see yellow and white. So all the native Galapagos flowers are either yellow or white. But people have brought in, for ornamental reasons, into their gardens all these different coloured plants, and they've gone off and kind of been set loose into the landscape. So what this monitor robot does is highly evolved specific vision that just sees in colour sensors. So it seeks out these strange frequencies of colour. In a flurry of blades, like a weed whacker, it hunts them down, mulches them, and chops them up. Clouds of insects follow this around, feeding off the plant matter. And you can see that also, it starts to grow moss as all kind of the organic matter and gets stuck in the system and becomes this strange sort of new type of plant growing around, brightly coloured, of course. And then in the landscape, you no longer see the flowers that have been destroyed, but you see these brightly coloured things hovering around the hill in the distance. Or the goat hunter, an evolution of the sharpshooters, which flies above the islands, drifting on the thermals, just like the native birds do. Drifting silently, monitoring the landscape with its twin eyes that kind of twist and move, and then dive sharply when they detect a goat below with their talons kind of destroy it. But not hunting, they follow migratory bird paths, monitoring ecosystems. And the idea is that across time, the distinction between the birds and these things starts to resolve, that they share the same airspace, they ride on the same thermals. These things then has this, we hacked a little Connect for this period of exhibition. It has these sensors now embedded in, which is actually kind of doing live scans of the landscape, which is registering colour levels. So the idea is to then mount a laser on it, and then it's going to be like a sniper shooting people wearing a red jumper or something in the next exhibition. But really what I wanted else to do is just kind of finish, I guess, by alluding to another sort of trip as we kind of come to a conclusion and maybe lead into the discussion bit as well, on another sort of island, an island we went to last year, the Australian outback. And here, the byproduct, it's a landscape really, it's a byproduct of our modern world. And if we talk about kind of the technology infiltrating the landscape of the Galapagos, this is a space that is really the scenes behind the contemporary cities that we know. Australia is known as the world's quarry, and every one of our little devices that we have beeping away and twinkling in our little pockets, a little piece of that device has come from this site here, which is the Kalgoorlie gold mine in Australia. Another extraordinary unnatural landscape or new nature. But it's a new nature that's directly come out of a very particular relationship with the technologies of the cities that we know. So let's see a little bit how gold gets here, I suppose, which is interesting to trace that trail back. So these are the mining maps that mining companies use in order to construct their image, their plan for what the shape of a mine is. The brown is the ore body, so it's what they've detected, and these are other images. They're what they've detected to be the content where the gold is. So this is the green in this image. And then what happens is they have this modeling software they input gold prices into. So the shape of that hole changes depending on what the gold price is. If gold is high in value, then you dig up much lower concentration because it's more cost effective to do so. If it's much higher in concentration, if it's much lower in concentration, then the hole is much smaller because it costs so much to get it out. So what happens is that these massive holes in the ground are actually real-time graphs of a changing gold price. Gold is now almost $2,000 an ounce, I think. These holes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So you have this extraordinary relationship between what is essentially a virtual commodity, that being the gold price. The gold is dug up, it's then put in a vault in HSBC in London, and then traded virtually. And those virtual trades actually have consequence at the scale of the mine in Australia. This is us a kilometre underground of the Australian gold mine. That's how you kind of get there, is drilling these extraordinary, strange new beasts, just like the specimens in Brazil, these strange new creatures that occupy the landscape. This is the very real end of virtual trading with gold prices, I suppose. These massive machines and the infrastructure that supports the refinery. This is a tank of bacteria which is eating away at the gold to refine it ever more finely. Extraordinarily expensive because gold prices are so high, they're able to do it. And the gold room, the enormous gold room, where it's poured. The one guy in the whole mine that has access to that, pouring his gold bar. So from 40 trucks that you saw, that big truck here, 40 of these, you get one gold bar this big. That we held in our hands for $750,000 US. So that is really, this gold then is very raw, it's unrefined, and then goes into our contemporary technology. Because gold is non-corrosive, so it's used in a whole lot of different things. This extraordinary new nature of the Australian landscape, massive excavations, are really kind of the result of this, I suppose. They're these twin worlds, kind of the dislocated hinterlands and remote wilderness that lie behind these scenes. And I guess that's what we do in unknown fields, is we head off to these places that are actually kind of shaped by and in turn support what this is, as a means to start to, start to understand these places that we're more familiar with in new ways, I suppose. I'm anxious to get into the more loose discussions, so I'm going to skip over things, but I want to finish on that quote here. Which not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. And I guess that's what we're talking about. But hopefully, the idea of looking as a project, the idea of revaluing the ground tour, getting out from the studio out into the landscape, exploring a speculative project, but at the same time exploring the science fictional present of these extreme landscapes, is really to understand them in new ways, to understand our present in new ways. Yeah.
Thanks. So yeah, I'd love to open up a general open discussion with a few specific questions. Just a reminder to those of you who showed up a little bit into the talk, there's drinks on the side, there's bathroom keys towards the door, and there's also a couple open chairs here in the middle. And we might turn these lights up a little bit brighter so that we can have more of a conversation. You don't fall asleep in the carbon dioxide of the room. But I just kind of launched a Q&A. I guess I'm curious about maybe just stepping back a little bit and talking about your relationship to architecture. And it's kind of a lame question, and we've talked about it together individually. But I'm curious about you teach at an architecture school. You are taking architecture students, but obviously you're not showing buildings at the end of these processes. And you said that you are designing and illustrating scenarios, not discrete buildings. So I guess I'm just curious if you can talk about that, about the idea of sort of laying the conceptual space for architecture to occur, but maybe not exploring architecture as such.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I was trying to say at the start, I think that what's interesting for us is that, that we do have this capacity to sit between a lot of these different disciplines. A lot of times an architect can sit at a table and having a conversation with a filmmaker or an engineer or a scientist. We bridge those worlds in a way because we have to start to manage the complexities of teams and multiple disciplines. So I think that kind of shared knowledge is interesting. So for us, the capacity for actually to act at a much larger scale, beyond the scale of the building, but actually to act as provocateurs, I suppose. So the provocative project is really intriguing, I guess, because there's different sorts of architects. We run a studio that people get to choose from. There are other studios that are very much more scripted and organized around the designing of buildings. but we like to think that the people that come through our program go into spatial field, but not necessarily fields of construction or making or designing buildings. And the speculative project doesn't need to be seen as something which is only judged by the point at which it becomes realized, but the speculative project becomes an end to and of itself, and the provocation becomes the end game, I suppose.
There's an organization in Los Angeles that where you and I were in January, but it's called the Center for Land Use Interpretation, and it does a lot of this sort of taxonomy of different land uses that humans engage in, and how human beings have effectively resurfaced certain areas of the planet in order to allow what we call civilization to occur. So it's things like mines and gravel pits and even parking lots, reservoirs, et cetera, et cetera. But it's interesting in the sense that I feel like your project is, and when I say your project, I mean the overall sort of unknown fields division idea, is really kind of taking the Center for Land Use Interpretation and not only going global with it, but almost kind of wedding it with like a comparative mythology department or that kind of thing. And I guess it's that adding of narrative that I think is really interesting about a lot of the projects you do. But it's also then, you mentioned, sitting down with a filmmaker and so on, but you actually literally bring with you on these trips people like, you had a kind of a resident novelist, Will Wiles, and you obviously have had photographers and whatnot. But so I guess I'm interested in that idea that perhaps it's not even architects that would actually have an insight on built space, or the residues of built space, or the margins of built space, but it's these other disciplines. And I'm curious then sort of what collaborations have been really productive, and then what ones have not worked out as planned, but yet someday, but maybe film doesn't work the way you want, et cetera. So I'm just curious about those collaborations.
Yeah. I mean, I think we started doing it kind of more intensely recently, and it's going to be something that we're going to try and scale up through the next few trips. But I mean, we always, I guess, had the ambition to take a whole group of super interesting people with us as a means to start to expand the range that we start to see these sites. So that what was really fantastic was to have Will with us, Will Wiles is a novelist, also editor of Icon magazine in London, and he came with us to the recent Chernobyl and Baikonur trip. There's a few guys in the audience that were on the trip with us as well, and his kind of remit was to not draw anything but to sketch through words, because so often we go on these trips, one of the real problems is we go around with a camera glued to our face and we just take photographs. Really what is necessary in terms of uncovering the potential for some of these speculations and narratives is to dig much deeper than that, and to actually throw through different mediums. So we'll to see him sketching through words and just going around the sites writing these little fragments and these little narratives, creating these literary sketches, was really amazing, and then kind of fed into an idea about how we're starting now to develop new narratives for these places, that then start to be illustrated after the fact as opposed to kind of furnishing them with images to start with. And they were also part of the process of now that we're taking photographs and actually attaching some of these bits of text to them and kind of giving them a new narration, taking them out of their existing context and imagining Chernobyl, for instance, is no longer a ruinous relic of Soviet era, but potentially kind of a strange new condition somewhere in Japan, off the coast of Britain, and the nuclear sites there, so that that direct engagement with someone who does write in a narrative way was really, really exciting. Because as architects, we think we deal with narrative, we do narrative projects. When it comes to actually dealing with a writer, you realise just how crap we are at actually writing. And that was fantastic. We had Michael Madsen with us as well in Chernobyl, which he was amazing. He did the film Into Eternity. I don't know if any of you guys saw it. It's about the Onkalo, the nuclear waste storage site proposed they're digging up in Finland. So he has this relationship to I guess, the cultural psychology of these places, and the meaning of them, beyond just the thing discovered, but the meaning in long time spans. And he came out with this, and he started off by filming the actual locations, but then he moved into a mode where he would just sit with us and ask us to retell our dreams. Because his idea was that going and visiting these places somehow shifts our psychology a little bit, and he wanted to record our dream space as opposed to recording the real space that we're going through. So we had these very intimate sessions where he'd lock us in a room alone, and he'd ask these very deep and probing questions. I don't know if any of these guys can attest to it. Where he'd just try and he'd ask us to recount our dreams from the night before, no matter how kind of saucy, the more saucy the better for him. It turned out to be, no matter how strange, and then he would ask these abstract questions, and now he's putting that together and editing it into a piece where he's not going to really use any of the footage much at all, but it's just going to be these narrations over the top of just very still 3D images. He shot the sites in 3D. And that was, I think that's another really interesting way to actually start to take these, to take the site and kind of recontextualize it through narrative, I suppose. I don't know if there are ones that haven't worked out yet. I guess I don't know, it's too early to tell. I think, I think any kind of input is good input, I suppose, because it just creates some sort of tension, which is interesting. And the next trip we were talking about is that you mentioned up to Alaska. There's a photographer which we've been talking about that's going to come with us, and she does this extraordinary project at the moment called Markers of Time, and she's been traveling around the Arctic region looking at various indicator species and coat change species, and documenting the natural and artificial time cycles of these regions. So she has this beautiful photo series of the Arctic fox, whose coat changes colour based on the path of the sun. But what's happening is the natural cycle of the snow melting is now out of sync with the seasons. So she's got these extraordinary images of this really bright white Arctic fox sitting within this brown, dirt, dusty landscape. And she's got other sets of photographs where she's photographing the aurora, but underneath it is the blurred long exposure headlights of an ice road trucker. So you get these collapsing of these two different time cycles, and just through that kind of that field work, that idea of kind of strategic looking, I guess she's revealing a really interesting kind of dynamic that's happening out there. This kind of slow kind of shifting of a natural cycle and an artificial one. She's going to come out with us and do photography workshops and stuff up in the north. So I think that'll be another one that'll be super interesting, because it again extends that idea of very critical looking, I suppose, to actually reveal proposition. Because from there you can start to draw implications back in our own familiar cities. The idea that those kind of phase shifts are so subtle that you have to go right up to the extremes of the Earth in order to see them. But they're still playing out in our cities back here, but just not at the scale or time scale that we can register it. So going off there, you see it playing out, you start to develop propositions and scenarios and speculations around it, which then informs a way that we might start to adjust the way that we occupy the metropolis. I think, which is interesting. There's another site that we're talking with her about that we're hoping to see. I've been up to Anchorage, but the stories we're told, we haven't been yet, but the stories we're told is that it's quite an ugly city, but what's amazing about it is that people live with such an awareness of the cycles that are existing around them. And that kind of embeddedness when nature is allowed to creep back into the city, not seeing them as oppositions, not seeing them as being independent of one another, I think is intriguing. And to go out there and see it play out and bring it back here is kind of the strategy, I suppose.
So when you look at the globe, are you looking at an atlas of limit cases, basically? Or, I mean, where are limit cases and where are not? What's on your map?
It's fun. I just came out of the process, just literally, as Geoff said, fresh from last week. We were having conversations about where we were going to go, and we decided on Alaska. But 3 weeks before that it's both an exceptionally daunting and exciting time. Because literally, you just kind of take a look at the map and you put pins on it as to where you want to go, I suppose, or we can dance around. What we were going to do before Alaska was we were going to do the Congo. I don't know if anyone knows much about the Congo, but Michael Madsen made us read on the trip Heart of Darkness, the Joseph Conrad novel, because he wants some of the next project he wants to go up the river. It's kind of an extension, I guess, of the thing that I was talking about with the Australia project. That in the Congo, you have this extraordinary connection between the metropolis and the kind of a remote, dislocated third world country. The Congo is one of the world's greatest concentrations of rare earth minerals. The 3 T's they call them. Every bone, every piece of technology has some of this mineral in it. And what happened in the Congo, I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to get some of it wrong, so people that are much more willing to please cut me off. But what we found amazing was a discussion of the PlayStation War. I don't know if people have heard of this, but my understanding of it is that there was this run on PlayStations 2s. Everyone bought them out over Christmas morning to have their kid with a PlayStation 2 on a Christmas tree in the morning. They sold out of PlayStation 2, so there was this great, because there was this amazing shortage in tungsten, or coltan, which is one of the key ingredients in some of the chips in the PlayStation. So that kind of momentary shortage caused the price of this rare earth mineral to go from $49 an ounce to $749 an ounce. An extraordinary catastrophic rise. So what that meant was that you take one of the world's most valuable resources, you put it at its richest concentration in one of the world's most volatile political structures, and you've got some crazy shit going on. So the PlayStation War was the discussion of the conflicts that arose when the army basically saw that this stuff was being sold for $750 an ounce. They moved in and took over all the mine sites and created all this horror that's now happening around the mines and people being forced under slave labor to get it out. And then it's smuggled from Congo. So you have this extraordinary network between Congo and China, where it's the rare earth minerals smuggled out of Congo into China, mixed with other minerals, because China's the other big producer of rare earth minerals in the world, and then put into electronics and then shipped off to Apple or whatever. So you have this amazing kind of black infrastructural trail that actually kind of comes into this room in every single person's pocket, and the idea was to go out and to recreate kind of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness journey and travel the Congo River by boat and get off the boat every day or so and go off and see one of the mines. And we kind of structured that, and we've done the itinerary for it and actually priced it up, but then our insurance guys in the AA saw the Foreign Office advice, which just recently changed. It basically says, do not go anywhere near the Congo. And that happened about 2 weeks ago, so we had to get rid of our trip. But it's still on the agenda, because I'm sure you've seen the campaigns now for conflict-free technologies. Like that phrase, conflict-free technology, I think is a really fascinating one, which is trying to create awareness, just like the Blood Diamond movement, trying to create an awareness for technology which is free of these minerals. I'm not entirely sure what we would have done out there. I'm not sure at the scope of how we can operate would have actually contributed to that system yet, but we're intrigued by the possibilities, I suppose. So that's what we've found one limit so far. The only other limit we have is financial, but I think we've figured out a way that you can pretty much get to anywhere in the world for a 2-week period of time for £1,200 if you work hard. I think that's the upper limit.
I'm curious if it's too postmodern for your taste, like to do something that would be maybe a bit like a Don DeLillo novel and thus uninteresting, but if you were to go to like a suburb in Orange County, California, or if you were to travel through Starbucks of suburban New Jersey or that kind of thing, like is there, I guarantee you could find some really interesting things because of the things that you would be looking for.
Yeah.
But would the allure run out, or what would prevent you from doing like the utterly banal trip?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure there's scope to do it. I get our interest at the moment is in kind of seeking out otherness, and through that otherness, we actually are able to kind of get a distance view to look back on the familiar, I suppose. So it's the same kind of distancing trope that you get in science fiction, which no science fiction is ever, of course, about the predictive future. You never judge it based on whether it comes true or not. You judge it based on what it reveals about the present. It's always an exaggeration of the everyday, as opposed to it being, as opposed to it being about prediction. And I guess that kind of format was what kind of interested us in going to the extreme territories. So the banal, I don't know. If it became banal to the point that it became other, I guess then it would be interesting. I mean, the closest trip to home, that we want to do is kind of the trip that we're going to do in the summer, the next version of the Chernobyl and Baikonur, and it's going to be through the States, and we're going to take that idea of the alien other, I suppose, and the theme is studio based around different forms of the alien, I guess. We're going to start a lot of water in Mexico and explore the kind of the immigrant alien. And then the plan, we're heading up through New Mexico, through Roswell, we go to a highway, explore the extraterrestrial other, the cosmic other. It's kind of an extension of the sort of stuff we started to think about in Baikonur. And then head further up through Nevada, Area 51, again thinking about kind of black military technologies, going to skunk works, the Lockheed Martin experimental test lab and stuff. Thinking about the way that kind of culturally we kind of mythologized all of the technologies that exist in this place as these strange kind of otherworldly things, and then finish at Burning Man Festival and kind of the cultural other, the social acts, I guess. So they're all, I guess, sites that are much more present in our collective consciousness, that are much more familiar, certainly for you guys, based over here. But I guess the way that we would treat that journey is to kind of frame it in a particular way, to frame it around, theme it around the kind of the mythologized technology of the alien. So to take something that was familiar with it, kind of give it a new narrative, I guess, is the way to take it.
The very question that you said about the type of studio you want. And nonetheless, where we go, travel, we do come from cities, we come from London, we come from New York City. And let's face it, the antagonist versus protagonist. Protagonists are mostly the hookers. We are antagonists. In other words, we don't really play the main role in this city. Somehow, we architects need to be much more active in terms of what subject we take on. Obviously, in those extraordinary planning to kind of convey his message, being sometimes ridiculous, sometimes paradoxical. But the displacement of the subject, such as the science fiction, that is sort of a bilateral understanding, so that you displace yourself and you understand it. So these relationships are sort of method of active way to deal with architecture today, because yes, we can submit and subjugate ourselves to so-called industry. But if you want to kind of stay in line or outside of it, and the question is, what kind of tools do you take up to be competitive? And not necessarily critical. I mean, it should be critical, but also not necessarily obnoxious, tenacious. So I just wanted to comment only because that's what I see here. There's very careful choices of places, phrases, this location.
In an answer or in an attempt to pull on that thread, I guess I just come back to kind of the question I asked originally, where I'm sort of seeing this disconnect between latching onto this idea of these curios and these kind of further and more exaggeratedly exoticized creatures and otherified things, because I think their fact of being provocative is exactly what makes them so banal. I mean, it's like we're talking these sort of Victorian curios where, kind of the height of popular culture to go see, P.T. Barnum's showcase of freaks. And he was doing it just as much to nature as to humans, to anybody who wasn't, white and Western. So I guess I sort of, again, see that kind of disconnect is how this has to do with nature as much as just the idea of otherness in general. So I feel like it's actually kind of anti-provocative to use that same logic of the curio, the freak show, to show this kind of what I do think is a very interesting action that you've done, to go to these distant places and kind of try to take on that otherness as a way of looking back on ourselves, but instead to just bring something back that's like a hyper-fetishized creature would just be pandering even more so to that attractiveness to the kind of mainstream.
Yeah.
I've had kind of a thought in response to that, which I'm curious about what you think about too, but throughout I'm thinking, what are you learning about the power of these various kind of carriers of narrative and myth, And so the freak show is clearly a powerful and sticky carrier of a particular type of narrative and myth. And so perhaps you say, you learn something about why that's so sticky, and can you use it or can you only comment on it? I don't know, but I think what's kind of interesting is then you look at the goal points, and that's a particularly powerful force that's shaping them too. So I'm just curious about, you're clearly finding out somehow what makes stories very sticky, but then can you use those tools?
Yeah, I guess there's a great term, my teaching partner in Unknown Field Series in Kate, she does a series of projects called prosthetic mythology. The first one of those, I'm trying to dig it up. First one of those is based in this forest in the northern north of England, just on the border of Scotland. It's a place called Kielder Forest, and Kielder is a completely constructed an artificial forest that you wouldn't know from looking at it. It's actually a plantation forest. And they went up there and spent lots of time there. They did these time-lapse films from dusk till dawn of the forest changing. And they saw it as being a landscape without mythology, I suppose. So they saw it as being a landscape without mythology. So what they did was they did these time-lapse films where she looked at our relationship to dusk and dawn, I suppose, as kind of glitching out, as the site where so many stories about nature, so many of the kind of the folklore of forests and wilderness start to come about. So she did this, what they did was they created this whole network of these strange machines that attached themselves to trees in the forest that had a low light sensor on them. So at dusk and dawn they would come on and start to drum, almost like tribal drumming. So the idea was to go to imbue this unnatural landscape with a kind of a new mythology, prosthetic mythology, as a means to start to speculate on another way that we might start to relate to it. And so I think that an understanding of narrative fiction in that way starts to be operationalized in design sense in those terms. But equally, I think something that we were looking at in Australia is the future of these massive kind of landscapes and ground territories, and also thinking about them the same way that Kate was thinking about the forest. The idea that
Did it knock you off?
Anyway, so what we were talking about in Australia was this idea that that there are different stances in the way that we actually deal with these manufactured landscapes of resources. Either we kind of stop it and we find a new energy source that doesn't require those kind of violent decisions. We seem desperately unlikely, especially like one of the reasons to go after Alaska is to think about the Arctic refuge, which is now the subject of all the drilling controversy. And I don't know, we're just still starting to research it, but the idea that we're not going to stick a big drill in that and get the oil out seems rather far-fetched, I suppose. So one strategy is to kind of stop it, which I don't see happening. Another is to kind of reimagine our cultural relationship to the resource industry. At the moment we just kind of put things off to the margins. These hinterlands that we can so easily ignore and forget about, and so many trips like our trip to Australia where we follow, for instance, the iron ore supply train all the way from the hole in the ground to the port where it gets shipped off to China to create a giant steel. That backstory to the world that we know, the cities that we know, is kind of lost, I guess. So to think about these sites and how we can actually start to design them or think about them or reimagine them, I suppose, that actually starts to help us to understand a new way that is interesting and perhaps even kind of necessary. What we found in Australia was that, and I think with most other sites in the world as well, also in terms of the Arctic refuge up in Canada, is that we've kind of gone through our first wave of resource mining. We've gone through the stuff that's easily accessible, it's kind of out of the way, it's in the middle of nowhere, that no one wanted anyway. And we're now at a point where that sort of process has been exhausted, and everywhere we're asking questions about what we do with the next phase. And that next phase is now either encroaching on the cities that we know and we live in, or it's encroaching on, like Kangaroo National Park, we're talking about mining in Australia now, the Arctic refuge, we're talking about mining. So this whole next phase is about to be opened up, and what we do in relationship to that is going to define us, for the next set of generations to come. And the idea that thinking of kind of where we get our power from is something that is just kind of ignored and forgotten and lost in the wilderness isn't particularly manageable in the long term, I suppose. So that idea of narrative and myth, I don't know, I think there's something implicit in that actually suggests the way that we might start to think about those resources in new ways.
Good question. It's sort of regards where you ended the slideshow.
Yeah.
I think that the unknown fields division is sort of interesting because it explores the secondary landscapes that are produced by our primary society. But the fascination with them is almost limited because we can't recreate them or create new ones without having another primary source. Follow me thinking, like, you're exploring ones that exist. How do we create more without first creating the primary landscape? This is sort of an impasse that comes in.
How do we create more wilderness, more
Yeah, but more of these unnatural places.
I think we're doing a pretty good job of it already.
Sorry?
I think we're doing a pretty good job of creating them.
Yeah, well,
already.
are we, I'm personally fascinated with them. I'd love to see them exist within the primary sort of civilizations, like somewhere in Midtown Manhattan. I'd love to see an unknown field. I'm sure it exists somewhere. I mean, I can't see it at the moment, but yeah. Is there a way to get beyond this, or are we sort of stuck in? Look for new ones.
I mean, one thing I glossed over, I suppose, was some stuff back in the contemporary city, I guess, where, the discussion about cities now is that, the discussion about cities now is that they're actually becoming hotbeds for evolutionary change. That actually cities are becoming one of the most studied sites for biologists because change occurs in them so frequently.
But if you understand the construction of this thing is absolutely a byproduct of a primary. So it really isn't an intended product rather than intended. So your question is a bit absurd because you can't really do that.
Yeah. Oh no. Like this, what I'm showing here is this. So this is a. So this is a crow in Japan. So it's talking about the crow adapting to living in the city.
They have organized a way of eating a food that normally they can't manage.
Yeah, so they now live off this nut which their beak hasn't evolved to be able to crack. And the way that they do it is dropping the nut into the traffic and then letting the cars drive over it and crush it. But not only that, what's even more extraordinary.
Dropping the nuts from a great height onto a hard road.
There was a guy that wrote a book about New York City as being one of the most diverse ecological zones. Because of all these secondary spaces that we don't enjoy.
Yeah, well, I mean, but the space of the city are forcing changes within animals and adaptations really quickly. So this thing now drops it from the power line over the traffic. A lot of them are getting killed because they're getting run over by cars. Now their strategy has evolved, and now they drop them over pedestrian crossings. And they wait for the traffic lights to turn red, and they walk out with people, just like, over the desert crossings and eating the nut. And that kind of dependence is extraordinary. I was just finished an art residency in the hills of San Francisco, where I was walking around with an ecologist, and we were talking about raccoons. I don't know if anyone's lived in San Francisco, but raccoons are just everywhere. And people treat them as real pests. They get into the city, they get into people's bins. All the bins have these special lids on them to stop people from accessing, stop the raccoons from accessing. But what she was talking about was that actually raccoons are playing this really integral role in the urban ecosystem. That they're recycling our trash, they're composting it for us. It's illegal in San Francisco and California, not to compost. No, San Francisco, which is I find extraordinary. This is the crow picking up using the zebra crossing to So the raccoons in San Francisco are actually playing a really kind of critical part to do that recycling for us. So rather than kind of get rid of the raccoon, what we should be doing is actually encouraging it into our cities more. People shoo raccoons away to get rid of it. This is a shot from San Francisco of a bus driver that feeds the raccoon every night, so they know to follow his bus route. So they actually catch the number 18. He gives them dog food. We should be encouraging them into our cities more than what we are. That we shouldn't be seeing them as being the city as being separate from the natural system, but to look for gaps, cracks, and opportunities where the two can start to overlay each other. And that's what a lot of biology is shifting towards now. I mean, even the rat, we don't like the rat, but rats have evolved to become utterly dependent on our cities. We take the city away and put them back out into the landscape, then it will be able to survive. So I think there's already that kind of potential for otherness in the city. Maybe it talks to the thing you were talking about Manaugh, I suppose, that you dig deep enough that anything becomes kind of extraordinary, I guess. But that's just in the city. I mean, this is the raccoon digging in the bins. But even the nature of our homes as well, we think of as being so ordinary and familiar, actually becoming strange, bizarre places, as we kind of lose ourselves in our kind of networks of Facebook and Twitter that become much more closer to us than our next door neighbor is. We spend our time on iPlayer, iPods, whatever, doing that sort of stuff. We share our homes with these strange new creatures, with weird kind of bellies of dust that crawl around the house that our cats ride on. We're not, in a way, we start to become not really sure which one is the pet and which one is the device, you know? Like, you know, the Roomba seems to have a personality in the same way as the cat does. So I think the everyday spaces of our house, you know, the house which tweets to us if we left the light on. You know, Justin Bieber tweets at me, you know. I mean, we did this is another one of the specimens that we did, which is called the goldfish avatar. So on the right you can't really see in this light, but there's a goldfish in that tank. It's a Japanese fighting fish. And above it is this weird overseeing eye, which is a webcam. And what it's doing is tracking the movements of the goldfish. And those movements are then controlling this virtual representation of the goldfish which is online, which was online, next to it. So the goldfish is the brain, I suppose, for this digital simulation. What happens is that the goldfish dies, as they inevitably do, it gets flushed down the toilet, but based on the movements that have been tracked and logged, the digital avatar keeps on living. The idea is that across time, more and more of these kind of digital things start to live out on the internet. The internet becomes the kind of wilderness for these things. It's not living out their lives. So everything is becoming augmented, I suppose, from the banality of our domestic couch to the familiarity of a city like San Francisco, you know, or the Crow in Japan. But you know, this is the state where things are. That the line between one and the other is becoming increasingly blurred, and I guess the idea is to actually speculate on how one can exaggerate that.
What I think that's really interesting about all this is that you're not designing the unknown, you're exploring unknown fields and looking at the sorts of created them and then populating them with creatures as opposed to focusing on the environment or focusing on what exists in the environment. And I think there's an interesting correlation with the term wildness and what that can mean for the progression and the future scenarios of what we already have. If that's really the direction that we might be heading into, actually a more wild, a sort of urban wilderness that we weren't sort of prepared for or aware of.
Yeah. I mean, maybe. I think a lot of the creature projects are not really. I mean, it's just one part of the work we do, I guess. They're not really designed tasks, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not imagining. I mean, I guess there is a discussion about the nature of the future of infrastructure, to say that rather than infrastructure being centralized, it can actually be kind of fragmented and kind of operating drone networks and swarming around, all that sort of stuff, which is, I guess, part of the conversation as well. But I'm not kind of proposing that these things will actually be launched off into the landscape. What they're really doing is trying to explore our cultural relationship to these things, and I guess that was part of putting within that lineage of you know, the way we've culturally dealt with nature and curiosity across time. But you know, it's operating at a different scale, I guess, than the particular proposal. So I guess I'm not. Maybe it's kind of being a little bit kind of non-committal and ambiguous, I guess. But I'm not kind of advocating any of these as kind of desirable features. I guess I'm just exploring possibilities so that kind of, you know, it starts to, I guess, generate a discussion. You know, a similar discussion like what we were having before. Like, that's the object, is to have an argument around it as opposed to being discrete proposal.
The cultural relationship, is it one of guilt?
Sorry?
Should we feel guilt or only see some architectural or design options?
Yeah, I have no sense of guilt whatsoever, I suppose, about our relationship to these things. Like, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, like, because yeah, because I guess I'm not placing value judgments on these things. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to, I guess, not critique, but examine a conservationist view of the natural world that sets up what we do and nature as different and opposing things. I don't think that they necessarily are, or they haven't. Nature hasn't been the way that we define it in the conservationist terms for a long time, for all intents and purposes, too far back for it to be really relevant. You know? So I don't see it as being right or wrong. You know what I mean? It's too complex to actually have feelings of guilt about it. And I guess part of it is just revealing that complexity. You know what I mean? I mean, that's part of going to those sites and going to experience
You
stuff.
would prefer to go subversive, absurd, radical, rather than...
Yeah, you gotta, what was combative, I suppose. Yeah, that's certainly, and a fun position to operate in. But equally, you know, neither do we want to be purely dystopian and present these horror stories or these cautionary tales as it being just the singular mode of operating. Like it's interesting that Geoff talks about the specimens in the Galapagos being dystopian because, I mean, in a way, some of the specimens, like some of the early ones that I was skipping over, like the artificial aurora, which is these guys, which are these kind of artificial fireflies that dance around through the air, kind of feeding off wireless signals, becoming these kind of Wi-Fi kind of aurora clouds. I mean, they're also quite wondrous and magical at the same time, and I think the point of just putting them out there is to, you know, for some people that the idea of kind of fracturing infrastructure, or the internet as an infrastructure and dispersing it into kind of clouds of drones that see peripheral. For others, it seems magical and wondrous, and I think that the nature of, you know, it's just trying to elicit a reaction one way or the other, as opposed to just purely constantly.
But you started with a really interesting, starting with Futurama, the whole optimistic relationship between nature and technology was an interesting move.
Yeah.
I mean, ways
Yeah, I mean, because I'm fascinated, like, because it seems a lot of times when you're an architect operating within these worlds of speculation, dystopian is the default position, I guess. Like, I think there's some super interesting stuff to be done in pure out-and-out optimism as well. I mean, we did this project with a group called Superflux, which was for Beam of Bees, which was looking at what happens to bee colony collapse and designing artificial and synthetic pollinators that would either support the bee ecosystem or kind of replace them. And it was presented in a way that was supposed to be endearing and desirable and positive, that these new kind of creatures we got to share our world with became kind of just another layer of wonder, I guess, across the city. And it was purely an optimistic exploration of the role that technology can play in the support of an ecosystem. I mean, you know, separate from any projects, I'm an out-and-out card-carrying techno-optimist. So I guess guilt isn't currently in my remit. But I'm horrified by some of the things I have seen.
Yeah.
But I don't feel guilty about it.
Yeah, so you could get an entire like Sebald model from the cat burning fucking robot. But an architect sees that and says, well, I can manipulate this relationship between technology and reality.
Yeah.
So if you met a student in the future, 20 years from now, you met a student who had been to the Galapagos with you, what would make you proud to have been their instructor? What would accomplishment of that student would be?
Right. Well, I think, like, what, again, in relationship to your question as well, that, like, what I tried to start with is the idea that, I mean, so often architects see their role within these large questions as trying to somehow answer them, which is just ridiculous. I mean, we have nothing to do with the scale of operations that these things play out at. What we try and do, and I guess what I would see as being a positive outcome of some of these studios is if the project is successful in generating discussion around it. You know, the projects are supposed to instigate a conversation, you know, and allow us to see the question in a new way. You know what I mean? So they become projects about reframing as opposed to projects about definitive and finite solutions, I guess. So I guess some of the students have gone on to, I mean, some have gone on to, you know, one graduate from this year that did this amazing project where he built his own 40,000 watt voltage generator and created an electrified dust landscape as a large moving miniature model. he's now working for Norman Foster, doing Norman Foster type stuff, which I guess is fine. I wouldn't have chosen that path, but another guy has who did this project about gold infrastructures and designed a series of we can show you in a second, but he designed a series of kind of a new network of gold objects encoded with the memories of the place that the gold came from. He now runs Foreign Office's research lab. Like they tried to set up a version of AMO, I guess, and he now runs that research lab. So he defines the research agenda and defines what they go and do. And I see that as being a really interesting kind of outcome. We had a guy in Australia that did his whole project was a motion graphic animation. He's now working in the film industry doing science fiction storyboarding and concept art for a new sci-fi series that we're doing on Channel 4. So, I see those kind of possible outcomes as being really intriguing. But they're all, I still say, are operating as architects. They're not making buildings, but they're working spatially. They're working in an urban way. But they're working through research and experimentation where the object of that research and experimentation isn't necessarily a physical outcome, but it's judged as a thing in itself.
I think just in the interest of time, and just to sort of, we're coming up on 8 o'clock, and I don't want to cut off the conversation, but I'd love to wrap this up just with like a quick sort of gesture towards something, which may be absurdly practical after this kind of slightly more abstract conversation. But then we can continue all this talk we'll open the windows and you can have some wine and we'll keep talking. But I'd love just to end maybe with just like a practical look at, what it might actually take to put together this kind of thing. I know that it's kind of or at least speaking only for myself, it's like a life fantasy to take all of my best friends and the people I admire and to go off on some crazy trip through Western Australia and so on. So I guess I'm just curious about, how the sort of practicalities of putting these kind of things together, like choosing a destination that matches the brief or the other way around. And then everything literally, like getting injections, getting the tickets, getting the insurance. I don't know, it's just such a complicated thing. I'd love to just sort of hear how you do it and what you recommend to other people.
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a marathon to get these things going, I suppose. But we treat it like a project, I suppose. Like what I was saying through the hiking trail was that the idea of treating looking and observation as a project in itself, I think, is really interesting. Don't just see these trips as being the grounds for work you're going to produce later, but the trip becomes an artifact. I think that's the way to start with it. So when we're looking for destinations, we start by thinking about the destination as a project, past, present, and key themes that we start to hang things around. So when we're doing the Congo, we're interested in, the Heart of Darkness, which is really seminal